Well, good morning. Welcome to January 23rd. It's hard to believe that we are three-fourths of the way through the month of January. As we say, time keeps going by faster and faster. A number of things have happened. Obviously, we have a new president and vice president and new leadership in Congress and in the Senate. Um, and then we have leadership throughout the states as well. And we just want to continue to pray for them and continue to pray for who we are to be in this world, regardless of who's in leadership, regardless of where we live, that we know that we serve Jesus as our King. What that means for us then also is it means that we look to Jesus for how we are to live our lives. And we get some hints there as we walk through the book, the Gospel of Mark, as Mark has been telling us about the life of Jesus. We're going to see some episodes this week and in the coming weeks, continuing a series of encounters of Jesus among the people, but also with the religious leaders watching and their various reactions. We're going to see a little bit of that again today. Well, as you saw on the screen just a second ago, we're in lesson 8 of our study of the Gospel of Mark. The remarkable journey begins, subtitled Faith and Hope. We're looking only at Mark 1 through 3 in this unit, and so we've got one more month to go after this. We've got chapter 3 coming up, and we'll be looking at continuing our study through February. We'll talk more in the coming weeks about what the next set of lessons is going to be about. Specifically, lesson 8 today is entitled Lessons from Patches and Wineskins. We're going to be looking specifically at Mark chapter 2, verses 18 to 22, a short passage. It's a couple things I want to point out about that. One, first, go ahead and get your Bibles open so that you'll be ready for that. But the other thing I think is important to recognize is that the title, as long as it is still incomplete because it only talks about two analogies that Jesus uses in this episode that we're going to be reading about. There's actually a third, which is the first one that he gives. Well, without further delay, let's go ahead and watch and pay attention to the reading of the text so that we can get ourselves acclimated. As we do that, I do want to go over a quick outline of what the text is going to look like. So let's do that real quickly. Again, the title, Lessons from Patches and Wineskins. Verse 18 is going to be a question about not fasting. We'll see what that means in a moment. And then we'll see Jesus' response. He'll give two responses. One is an analogy about being the bridegroom versus, that should say 19 and 20, not 12 to 20. And then you have another analogy, really a double analogy, but both of them have to do with the new versus the old. And we're going to be looking at verses 21 and 22. Let's go ahead and pay attention as we have this text recited for us.
Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and said to Jesus, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?" Jesus answered, "How can the guest of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot so long as he has them with them. The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one sews a patch of new cloth on an old garment. If he does, the new piece will pull away from the old and make the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, he pours new wine into new wineskins."
All right. Well, we're ready to jump right into the lesson then. Hope you have your Bibles open. We're going to go back over those verse by verse. Question: how much do you like change? How do you receive change? And not just little change. Obviously, there are times when that gets under our skin a little bit. Maybe there's a stop sign that turns into a red light. I've seen times when that happens. You're used to maybe being able to have right of way, and now all of a sudden you have to stop because the stoplight's there. It's a minor change, but it does change the way we do things. Maybe you don't like the way roads are changed. New highways are built, things like that. We could go through a number of things that require us to change our mindset about things. We'll talk about some technology later on in our lesson as well. There are different kinds of change. And one of the things we can say about Jesus, of course, is as he has arrived, he is bringing about change. And as the Pharisees and other scribes and other religious leaders are watching, they're observing and they're taking note. And one of the things we'll do at the end of our lesson is kind of go back and look at some of what we're seeing from the life of Jesus from their perspective, and then project that into the next two lessons as we go through this set of lessons where Jesus is encountering the religious leaders and other people and how they will respond. Jesus is bringing about change, and one of those changes is the way things are done, the new covenant, as we'll see. Well, let's go ahead and look at the text. We saw already that we're at a time after the call of Levi, after the time of the meeting with Levi and his friends, the other tax collectors and sinners. The text doesn't tell us exactly when this occurred after that event, but given the fact that each of the episodes preceding this event and following this event are specific instances, I have no reason to believe, have no reason not to believe that what we see in this text is not just a general statement about common practices, but that there was a specific time frame in mind. And so clearly Jesus is going to respond to that. So what we have here is a scenario where John's disciples, we're talking about John the Baptist here, and the Pharisees and their disciples, they are all fasting. Now, the way the text reads, it could mean that they used to be fasting, or it was a time of fasting. A couple different ways to look at that. One is that this is just the practice. In other words, John's disciples fast and the Pharisees' disciples fast. But they notice that Jesus' disciples are not fasting. And so um, that's one scenario. It could be that there is a specific time of fasting that is going on. And as a result, the expectation is that all would be fasting. And yet, John's disciples and the Pharisees' disciples, while they're fasting, people observe that Jesus' disciples are not. And that prompts the question. And so the question comes to mind, why is it that Jesus' disciples are not fasting? Well, a couple things that we need to think about. First, we've already mentioned, was this a specific time of fasting? Now, the Old Testament only required and dictated a specific day to fast, and that was the Day of Atonement. Now, as you walk through the Old Testament, you're going to find a number of times that people did fast. Sometimes they called for a fast, sometimes they fasted on their own. At different times, it was a time of mourning, it was a time to reflect, it was a time of confession. Um, we do see sometimes when fasting was used as manipulation. For instance, in 1 Samuel, Saul requires people to fast from anything until victory is won. Of course, his own son doesn't hear that. He doesn't care. After he's eaten some honey, he's like, how are we going to fight without strength? And so once he did learn that he had broken a command of his father, he didn't really care. But that's a kind of a manipulation, trying to use fasting to bring about a victory. You can look throughout the Old Testament when there were times when leaders called for a fast. By the interbiblical period and by the first century, we know that Pharisees would often fast twice a week, typically a Monday and a Thursday. And we do have evidence of that event or that practice when we see in Luke chapter 18, when a Pharisee goes into the temple to pray, followed by a tax collector, and he talks about how he prays and that he fasts twice a week. So he's being a good Pharisee according to the rules that have been in place. And it could be that's what's going on. We don't know that there's anything in the text indicating that this is a specific holy day. It could be one of those 2 days of the week. It, again, could be simply that what Mark is telling us is that there were times as a custom that John's disciples would fast and when the Pharisees' disciples would fast. And so it would just be their common practice. And yet the observation is that Jesus' disciples don't. It could be that John's disciples are fasting as a sign of mourning or a sign of prayer. By the end of the first chapter, middle of the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark, we're told that Jesus begins his ministry after John the Baptist is put in prison. So at this point, John could still be in prison. It could be by this time he's already been executed, and that's a reason for the for the fasting. We just don't know. I do think that there's something specific going on here. The point that's also going to be made is that it's Jesus' disciples that are not fasting. Well, there are a couple of other questions that we can think about. Some of your translations are going to say some people asked about Jesus' disciples. The original just says they came to him and they asked him. Well, the question is, who is the they? It would seem kind of strange for John's disciples to approach Jesus. It would be strange for the Pharisees' disciples to approach. It would seem odd that they would both, as a group, since they weren't necessarily friends with each other necessarily. We just don't know. It could be that, as some translations say, some people, just to try and clean it up, some people observing these two groups of people that are fasting, but then also note that Jesus isn't fasting. So there could be that. We also don't know why they're asking. Is it just because it's a common practice that Jesus and his disciples have decided to abandon or to forego or just to ignore? One thought could be that because it's the disciples of the two groups that are fasting, that it may be reflective of their teacher. And since Jesus' disciples are not fasting, there's a question about who Jesus is and why he is not requiring that his disciples fast. So again, we saw in the healing of the paralytic, the question of Jesus' authority. There might be something going on here. One of the things we do know, of course, is Jesus is going to give a very, very significant answer here, and it's going to be a revelation, if we can use that term, of who he is as a result of what he teaches. So that's, some things to think about. And again, not reading between the lines, but trying to make sense of what's going on in the text. So I'm going to establish real quickly, I think this was a specific occasion of fasting because all the other events preceding and following in this set of verses, these five episodes that we're going to be looking at are exactly specific events. And I think that's what's going on here. And so it might have just been common Jewish practice, but John being a leader, the disciple or the Pharisees being leaders in some way, now that just kind of brings Jesus to the forefront and questions about his leadership and what does that mean. On a side note, I do think it's rather interesting that you do see John, his disciples, and the Pharisees and their disciples lumped into a group. Now, it doesn't mean that they were working together, but it could be what Mark is able to do. And we need to mention that Matthew and Luke have the same pericope in the exact same place as Mark does here. And there are going to be some little differences there in their episodes, their versions of it. We won't get into that a lot today. But what we do see is the beginning of the Gospel of Mark talking about John the Baptist as a prophet, if you will, and it could be representative of something remaining of the Old Covenant. And then you have the Pharisees, and they're becoming more prominent as the Gospel of Mark moves forward. And so you see a juxtaposition of the John and the Pharisees representing maybe something along these lines: the prophets and the law. So Pharisees, of course, are going to be representative of what it means to be a strict adherent, be a strict adherence to the law. There could be some of that going on, and especially with what Jesus is going to say in response here, that I think can be significant. But I don't want to take that and be merely metaphorical. I do want you to recognize that there are literal groups of John's disciples and literal groups of Pharisees' disciples that are fasting, but Jesus' disciples are not. So this still leaves up the question, why are they asking? Is it just for information, or is there something that they're trying to get in their understanding of Jesus? One thing I will say at this point, before I forget, is that on the two previous occasions that we've studied, at no time yet have the religious leaders, whether it was the scribes in chapter 2, verses 1 to 12, or the scribes of the Pharisees, in other words, scribes that were also Pharisees, in the text that we read last week, chapter 2, verses 13 to 17, at no time do those groups or those individuals address Jesus directly. In the first, they were thinking among themselves, and Jesus knew what they were thinking and responded to them. And in last week's lesson, we see that the Pharisees, or the scribes of the Pharisees, go to some of Jesus' disciples and ask. And when they ask, of course, Jesus hears them and he responds to them. Here, there is an unknown group of people asking about Jesus' disciples. And so there's the reference to the Pharisees, but the Pharisees, again, in each case, the first two times and now, are silent. Well, let me say moving forward, There will be more direct interaction. And I've been hinting at that in the last couple of weeks, saying it's coming, it's coming. We're going to see this direct interaction between the Pharisees and Jesus, and it's going to come, and it's going to come hard once we see the next two lessons. So bear that in mind. There's a question where Jesus is involved, but there is some kind of comparison with the Pharisees. And of course, the natural comparison with John the Baptist as the forerunner of Jesus and representing those old prophets. As we mentioned, fasting wasn't a requirement, but they were doing it. It would be beneficial, but not always necessary. What we'll see with Jesus' response here is that there's a proper time for the fasting. And you'll recall from Matthew chapter 6, when Jesus is uh, talking about from the Sermon on the Mount what kind of disciples they ought to be and what kind of followers of Christ they ought to be, that there were certain inappropriate and appropriate ways to fast, reasons to fast, how to fast, and so forth, as well as giving and with prayer. Well, the question comes up, why is it that your disciples, or why is it that Jesus' disciples do not fast? What is going on there? What might be the case? The John's disciples fast, the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast. Or if this is an exact and specific occasion, well, John's disciples are fasting, the Pharisees' disciples are fasting. Why are your disciples, Jesus, your disciples, why are they not fasting? What we're going to see is a threefold analogy. One that we're going to look at is going to be an analogy from the wedding, and two other analogies, which are lumped together to basically make one point, will come from some of their practices and the way they go about living their lives, the way they live their daily lives. So the response, Jesus is posed the question, or the question is asked, why isn't that your disciples do not fast? And here's Jesus' response. Jesus said to them, while the bridegroom is with them, the attendants of the groom cannot fast, can they? Well, let's stop there for a moment. One, Jesus is speaking to them, so he's responding. Then he talks about the groom or the bridegroom, some translations will say, and he's pointing out the presence of the bridegroom. Here's a scenario. He wants to give them a general principle about what goes on in something they are familiar with in daily life that is going to be a way for them to understand what Jesus is saying about why his disciples don't fast. The first thing he does is he asks them a question. And there are a couple of words here that I think need to be um, talked about a little bit. Some translations are going to say guests of the bridegroom. The New American Standard here says attendants of the groom. The phrase is literally those who are the sons of the bridal chamber. And bridal chamber is used in a couple of places. You can see it in Psalm 19 and a couple of other places in the Old Testament related to, as we'll see in a moment, God as the groom of the people of Israel. But what Jesus is saying here is that it is not really appropriate for the attendants of the groom, those that are working the wedding, those that are serving at the wedding, to fast. Now, I want to point out again, Jesus asked the question, but he asked the question in such a way as to expect a no answer. Some versions are going to say, how is it that, or how can the friends of the groom or the attendants of the groom fast while the groom is with them, while the wedding is going on? The point is, while it's the proper time to feast. I think the better way to ask the question is exactly as it is put out in most translations, where it's a direct question: can they fast when they have the groom with them? And then, of course, one way to get at the idea that this is a question expecting a no answer, you can ask it this way: can they fast when the groom is with them? Or say it this way: they can't fast while the groom is with them, can they? And the way the question is asked of the people, Jesus is expecting a no answer because he knows that's the common custom. And it's actually a negative thing to do, an inappropriate thing to do, to fast while it's time to feast. Well, the question is implying a no answer. They would say no, obviously, would say, well, of course, that's not the proper time to fast. You can't do that. It would not only be offensive, it's just not the appropriate thing to do. Well, what he goes on to say is this: while it's an implied no, he makes it a direct no. In the following statement, he says, as long as they have the groom with them, they cannot fast. Now, I know in our culture, we might say it's inappropriate, it might be offensive, but here they are not able to. It may be something like this also. Even if it were a time of fasting, the wedding trumps the fasting time, because now you have another episode, another institution in Jewish faith that takes precedent over that other practice. They can't. The time is not right for them to be fasting. So Jesus is basically saying, setting them up with something that they're familiar with so as to then give an explanation. He says, as long as the bridegroom is with them, they cannot fast. What do you think he's going for? He is clearly the one who is the bridegroom, because they're asking about his disciples. Well, in this analogy, Jesus' disciples are the attendants of the bridegroom, and Jesus is the bridegroom. He is the groom. Now, he does say it's that they can't and they shouldn't. It's not the right thing to do. The bridegroom is there. But then he goes on to say in verse 20, the days will come, literally, the days will come. It's a future, but the days will come when the groom will be taken away from them. And that word taken there is a kind of a violent taking. It's a word we'll see later in the text when it talks about the tearing away of the two parts of the linen, the patch from the garment. But he says that there will come a time when the groom is taken away from them, then they will fast on that day. And I like the way the original says, at that time they will fast on that day. So what Jesus is saying is, it's not the time to fast. I'm here. My disciples are not going to fast, but there will come a time when I am taken away and they will fast. And while it may seem a little early at this point, and it may seem a little veiled at this point, there's no doubt that what Jesus is talking about here is that he will, at some point in his ministry, when the religious leaders have had enough on a human level, when it's time on Jesus' level, when it's time for him to be arrested, it will happen. He will be arrested, he will be tried, he will be crucified and buried. And as Jesus will tell the disciples in John, they will have a time of mourning. And so what Jesus is saying is there is an appropriate time for the fast to occur. It's important to recognize that in this moment, Jesus is not indicating to them what that fast will look like. Um, the point is that there will be a time for fasting. Okay. It's very clear that most of the time fasting was an optional thing, except for the Day of the Atonement or the Day of Atonement. And of course, the Pharisees have instituted kind of a practice of doing it twice a day because they wanted to be holy. I don't want to take anything away from the intent at first, but of course, we recognize with the Pharisees, many of these things became very, very legalistic and became expectations. While they became, quote, models of what holiness looked like, it became a burden on the people when they couldn't do it themselves. But this becomes a pattern, a standard of comparing them with Jesus, and that's what's going on here. I think Jesus gives a very sound answer. It's not appropriate for them to fast. There will come a time when they do fast. And maybe he's acknowledging that either John's disciples or the Pharisees' disciples have a legitimate reason to fast if there is some kind of mourning or confession taking place. But he's saying, I'm here. That's not the time. So he offers up a very specific reason for why the disciples did not fast at the current time. Now, what I want you to see is he's going to pick up on two analogies that are general in nature. I mean, they're specific in the sense that they are specific illustrations, but they serve to be general foundations for what he's about to say. And I think, or for what he has just said. And what I think we need to recognize is there's not only Jesus himself coming, but what Jesus coming represents that's being played out here. And we see that in the two analogies. The first, of course, is the analogy of the patch. What I want you to see real quickly as we move forward is not yet are these parables. They are analogies, yet they are kind of precursors to kinds of things that Jesus will say when he does speak in parables. You are going to hear some people call these parables. They're really short, and you can have short parables. But I think what you see here is just the analogy that really becomes a springboard for when we see some of the parables that Jesus is recorded as saying in Mark, and those will begin in Mark chapter 4. but they're not parables in the classic sense. They don't fit the definition precisely. But if you were to call them parables, that's fine. A parable is kind of an analogy anyway. But he's using these as a general focus for what's taking place. His presence, that means his disciples are not going to fast yet, but there will come a time. Here he's going to give a general analogy. So what is that analogy? Well, as you heard, as you read, he says this, and it follows up with what he just said about the bridegroom. He says, no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth or new cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, what will happen is the patch will pull away from it, or to be taken away from it, and the new from the old, and a worse tear results. Let me read that again. New American Standard reads this way: no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the patch pulls away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear results. Well, this is something they would have practiced. I mean, today, when something tears, we may just throw it away. Some of you grew up whenever you, and I know this happened with me being a little boy, you would scrape your jeans because you fell on your knees. And rather than being able to afford buy new clothes all the time, we just buy a patch and put it on there. Now, if you're thinking of that kind of patch that's an iron-on patch, you're going to be missing the point that Jesus makes, because in that day and time, you would cut a piece of cloth from something new, from a new roll, for instance, or a new some new material, and then you would patch. Or what Jesus is saying here is you wouldn't take something new to do that. But the practice would be to patch that hole up, whatever that garment's hole was. You would find something to patch it up with. He says it makes no sense, and they know this from common practice. It would make no sense to take a new cloth and do that. Why? Because once it is washed, it will shrink, and when it does shrink, it will tear away from the old. In other words, the new doesn't fit the old. It will cause the tear. And what Jesus says here is that it makes that tear even worse. Now, I don't know that we want to dig too deep in the analogy to look for um, specific meaning there, although the general point is that there's an incompatibility of the new with the old. And they know this from common practice. Jesus is giving them something that they would know very easily. Then he adds to that another analogy. He goes into verse 22 and says, no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and the skin as well. But one puts new wine into fresh or new wineskins. Again, what he's doing is he's drawing on something that would be common practice. Well, what is going on here? Animal skins would have been used, sewn together, and that would have been the place to store wine. New wine, or excuse me, new skins would handle new wine, fresh wine that's unfermented, so that when it's poured into the wineskins, in the bag, so to speak, then as it ferments, the gases will bubble up and it will expand that wineskin. And maybe you open it up to let some of that escape. But the point is that the new skin can actually stretch and accommodate the fermenting process. If you have a wineskin that's been used over and over again, and it's already to the point of being stretched as far as it can go, then what happens when you put that wine into the wineskin, it's going to bubble up, it's going to ferment, the gases are going to be released, and what's going to happen is that wineskin is going to burst. And what Jesus says is, you've lost wine and you've lost skin. They're both useless now. Go back and look at Luke's version of this. And the reason I want you to do that is because one of the things that Luke is going to point out is, while in this analogy, we seem to think that it's, as we'll see in a moment, an attempt to show that the old covenant is no more useful. Luke gives indication that there will still be some use. It's just that there is not use of the wineskin, that is, but rather to preserve the usefulness of that wineskin, you would put the new wine into new wineskins. Again, showing some care not to press the analogy too far. We'll talk about some implications of that in a moment. But you can see what Jesus is doing here. He's hinted already about the bridegroom, that's him. And now he's talked about a patch. You don't take new garment and sew it into old garment. You don't take new wine and put it into old wineskins. The analogy here again, to one extent or another, is he represents the patch. What he brings, what he represents in coming, represents the patch, or is found in the patch. The new wine is symbolic of what he's bringing that is new. We could also say, to some extent or another, that with Jesus' disciples, they represent those things that are compatible with the new. Now, again, I don't want to press that too far, but I do know that the text starts off with asking about why Jesus' disciples don't fast. So Jesus starts with a general or a specific example that the disciples are like the groomsmen, and Jesus is the groom. It's not the appropriate time for them to fast. They will fast when he is gone. But he's also indicating that there is a new place, a new thing in order. And so you have the patch and the wine mentioned here. Well, those are great illustrations for the time. And I think even in my explaining that to you, you get a sense of what's going on there, but that's still kind of foreign. Let me see if I can come up with a couple of analogies as to what might be going on here that we can relate to. Some of these will relate to, and again, they're not going to be perfect, but they at least give us the indication regarding the incompatibility of old and new. One of the things that comes to my mind is, many of you have DVD players if you still watch DVDs. Some of you may have a Blu-ray DVD player. And the thing about it is that DVDs and Blu-rays look exactly alike. But you know that if you take a Blu-ray disc and put it in a regular DVD player, it won't work. Now, it's not necessarily going to destroy your DVD player, but it's certainly going to give you a warning you can't play it. No, you put a Blu-ray in a Blu-ray machine. Um, you know that programs on computers are always updated, and certain computers are only going to have certain capacity, whether it's space or speed. There are going to be certain programs on there. And of course, if you have any Windows products, that we've been through a number of editions of Windows over the last 20 plus 30 years, really. And so, the newer versions, the newer updates can't be on older computers. They just won't work. And sometimes they'll cause a crash that the computer just can't run it. If you don't have enough space on your computer and you try to download a new program, the new program is going to be too much and it won't be able to handle it. It'll slow the computer down. There are all kinds of problems you're going to run into. That's with new and old. Here's just a straight compatibility issue. You don't put diesel fuel in a car or a vehicle that takes unleaded. You just don't mix gases like that. They have a certain fuel that will mess up your car. Um, you'll have other issues. Remember the good old days, if you want to call them the good old days, when you had leaded and unleaded fuel. Today, pretty much everything's unleaded. Well, it's either unleaded or diesel. Um, and so you see an incompatibility there. Um, I grew up, I was one of the first generation to see the new video games. I remember Pong on Atari, or I remember Atari. I remember Nintendo. And what would happen is you would get updates, and the new games would not play on the old consoles. They just don't work. Um, I've been through several incarnations of the computer. I remember now. I remember watching and looking at the old 8-inch floppy disks, but I came along and started using a computer when we had the 4 or the 5 1/4 floppy disk. And then, of course, we had the 3.5-inch floppy disk. Well, you know that those are incompatible. Come along, then you have the flash drives and now the cloud. There's just incompatibility. The new doesn't fit the old. The old can't handle the new. There are a number of other examples that we can give. There was a book written back in the 1990s by Robert Nash. It was about churches needing to change, and many of you will relate to this language here. The title of the book was An 8-Track Church in a CD World. Now, for some who are watching, don't know what an 8-track is. It's a cassette, or it's a tape that was used. It was about this big, and it would go into the car. I remember my very first stereo console had a turntable on the top, had a nice sound system, and then it was an 8-track. Later on, I upgraded to cassettes. And of course, you can't play a cassette on an 8-track player. Then the CDs come along, and those took away the others. And of course, you see that there's a change. Well, even today, CDs are old because most people don't have CDs. You either download it or you'll find a way to get CDs. You can still play them in LPs and so forth with the vinyl. Some of what was old is new again. But you can think of some things where the new just doesn't fit the old. I'm thinking of car parts. I'm thinking of different parts of machinery. You can't put new parts on old machines. They just won't work. Here's another one that I was thinking of earlier. I just didn't write it down. Electrical systems. You're going to run into trouble if you try to run a new electrical board on a system that is knob and tube. Now, a majority of you know what I'm talking about. Some of you don't. The old electrical system can't handle the new electrical. It won't be able to handle all the electrical requirements that everything we have in our house does. We have the refrigerator, the dishwasher. I've got a bunch of lights on right now to see me clearly. I've got an air conditioner, or the heater is running right now. With everything going on at once, the old electrical system wouldn't be able to handle it. And you remember the days when you would bust a fuse, you would blow a fuse. Well, now we have breakers that trip, and that's nice. But we used to blow fuses, and I remember having to go to the store and replace all these fuses. Well, you understand then that there are certain things that are new that won't fit with the old. And essentially, that's what Jesus is doing here. What he's doing is he is representing something that's new. The question is this about new replacing old in the sense of an institution, or is it about the people individually? I think it could be a little bit of both. What I want us to see, though, as we look at this, is that Mark is giving us information about who Jesus is. With each episode, he's giving us more and more about who Jesus is. As I said, put yourself in the position of the religious leaders. Now, not exonerating them or absolving them of anything, but I want you to at least think, here they are, religious leaders. They represent what the standard of living a holy life according to law was. Here comes somebody who is gaining a following, who doesn't seem to follow their rules. He does things that only God can do. He claims to be able to do things only God can do. So we saw that a couple of weeks ago when we saw the healing of the paralytic, when he declared the man's sins were forgiven. We see that he also hangs around people that they would think God wouldn't approve of. Well, of course, Jesus responded to that. We see here he's not living the life that they are living. He doesn't seem to have concern about their practices of fasting. Now, of course, he gives a reason why, a legitimate reason in his mind. And of course, it is a legitimate reason given who he is. But they're just thinking this is some man who's just not got any concern for the laws that they live by. And what we're going to see in the next two lessons related to the Sabbath are going to be striking. And we'll see that there is going to be an even greater, by this time, a greater concerted effort to try and find an accusation against Jesus. So what we see here is this man that's coming on the scene that you and I know because we've read the story. We know the Gospels. But if you put yourself in the position of the crowds, put yourself in the position of the religious leaders, and they're seeing this taking place before their very eyes, they don't know what's going on. What's happening is little by little, they're getting information about who Jesus is. And with each word he speaks, with each act he commits, they're seeing it, but they're not seeing what you and I are seeing because we know the whole story. They are seeing something that is counter to everything that they stand for and everything that they know about. So keep that in mind. Again, we're not absolving them, we're not exonerating them, we're not giving them an excuse, but we have to understand that when Jesus came, people were only made aware of who he was little by little as he revealed himself through his words and his deeds. And there was a lot of misinterpreting what he meant, what he did. We know from this text, when Jesus talks about not fasting, he gives a specific reason why it's not appropriate for them to fast now. But he also is telling them that something new is here. And it may be something that they're not willing to accept. We know later that they won't accept it. Time won't allow me to go into some detail here, but when we talk about something new, like the new patch, the patch of new linen, or the new wine, think about the Old Testament and the fact that God had already predicted some new things coming. You know, the most famous passage is about the new covenant in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. But there are some other places that I want you to think about. And I've got these written down. I'm not going to read them, but I really want you to go back and think about these yourself. Isaiah, in the servant passages, the suffering servant passages, or the servant of the Lord passages, in the latter third of the book of Isaiah, beginning in chapter 40, of course, with the comfort my people, you see the introduction to the servant passages. There are a number of servant passages, a number of servant songs. But along the way, throughout some of these, there are references to things that are new, doing a new thing or bringing something new. So write these down, or as you need to, pause and look these up on your own. Isaiah 42:9. Isaiah 43:18-21, and this one probably is the one that's closest in analogy to what we've been looking at today. Then Isaiah 48:6, Isaiah 65:17. Now that is more eschatological in the sense that it's about the end of the end, when God talks about creating a new heaven and a new earth. We'll see a passage here in a moment that kind of parallels that as well. We've already mentioned Jeremiah 31. Ezekiel throughout mentions giving people a new heart, but there's also reference to an everlasting covenant. We do know from 2 Corinthians 5:17, Jesus will create us anew. Behold, what was old is new, born again. The new has come, the old has passed away. You know, all who are in Christ are a new creation. So there's a newness there. And then, of course, the Revelation, the book of Revelation mentions that Jesus says, I make all things new. Well, it all begins with him bringing something new. So what you have here with the patch and what you have here with the new wine is the fact that Jesus is bringing something new. The question is what he's bringing being attached to a garment that will accept it? Will it be poured into a wineskin that will accept it and not burst? And I guess if we wanted to, we could go a little bit further and talk about whether we represent the old garment or the old wineskin and not able to accept the new. Certainly that's something that's coming to the Jews and in Judaism and the Pharisees specifically when Jesus brings those up. What do they represent? We know that Jesus comes to bring things new. So as we come back together next week, we're going to be looking at two stories, one story next week and the one after that, related to the Sabbath and what Jesus does and the way he lives according to the Sabbath. So what we'll see as we go through this is the title of the lesson next week is going to be entitled The Lord's Day. Now, I'm going to have something to say about that next week and whether that's the appropriate term, but that's what our lesson writers call it. We're going to be looking at Mark 2, verses 23-28, and we'll call it the Lord's Day. Of course, it's going to be a story about the Sabbath and whether or not Jesus keeps the Sabbath as he should. Then what we'll see in the following week is his confronting the Pharisees about the Sabbath. Well, as we get ready to go, prepare our hearts for worship, prepare ourselves to give God the glory that he deserves, and then prepare ourselves as we worship to use that to propel us into the week ahead, prepared to live the life that he's called us to live. Let me conclude with a word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Father, I thank you for today, and I just pray right now that you will guide us to worship you the way you deserve and desire, that we will bring sacrifices of praise to you, that we will bring holy hands to you, that we will bring holy lives to you. Along the way, we do pray your Holy Spirit indwell us to sanctify us and make us and mold us in the image of your Son each day. Help us to be renewed, be transformed by the renewing of our minds and no longer conform to the pattern of this world. And Lord, I do pray you'll help us walk day by day as citizens of your kingdom, to walk worthy of the gospel of Christ. I do pray, Father, you help us to continue to ponder all that Jesus brought that was new, and help us to read these episodes anew and afresh to see how it is that you revealed yourself through your Son and how he brought promise and hope to us. We thank you for the salvation that we have by grace through faith. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. I do hope that you will have a good week. I pray that you will be safe. And as always, I pray that you be well and be blessed. Have a good week, and I'll see you next time.